The relentless pounding on the bathroom door echoed through the empty subway station at 2 a.m. Chris Gardner tightened his arms around his 5-year-old son Christopher, who was fast asleep despite the harsh fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. Using his left foot, Chris pressed firmly against the flimsy door of the public restroom, the only barrier between them and whoever was demanding entry outside. "Anyone in there?" The gruff voice belonged to a stranger, someone who clearly had no idea that behind this door sat a father and son with nowhere else to go. The smell of disinfectant mixed with something far worse filled Chris's nostrils, but he didn't dare move a muscle. Christopher stirred in his sleep, his small lips whispering, "Daddy, I'm cold." Tears rolled down Chris's weathered cheeks as he forced a smile his son couldn't see. "Shh, everything's going to be okay, buddy," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the distant rumble of the last train pulling away from the platform. As he looked down at his sleeping child, wrapped in a worn Superman t-shirt that had seen better days, one question haunted his mind. Would tomorrow bring them any hope? Or would they continue sinking deeper into this endless darkness? The footsteps outside gradually faded away, and Chris opened his eyes, staring straight into the void ahead, a dangerous decision slowly forming in his desperate mind. 6 months earlier, Chris Gardner adjusted his faded tie and pulled his squeaky-wheeled suitcase through the steep streets of San Francisco. Inside that battered case were portable bone density scanners, medical devices he'd invested everything in, believing they would revolutionize his family's future. Now they felt like concrete blocks weighing down his shoulders with each uphill climb to another medical office. "We already have X-ray equipment." The doctor in the small clinic shook his head, his eyes filled with pity rather than interest. "And this, well, it's quite expensive for what it does." That marked rejection number 23 for the week. Chris stepped out of the clinic and looked down at his business card, now wrinkled and stained, reading Gardner Medical Solutions in fading blue ink. A one-man company consisting of nothing but him and his increasingly distant dreams. When he returned to their small apartment, Linda was feeding Christopher dinner in their dimly lit kitchen. Electric bills piled high on the table, red final notice stamps glaring like warning signs of their impending doom. The apartment itself told the story of their financial decline. Furniture that had seen better decades, a refrigerator that hummed too loudly because they couldn't afford repairs, and walls so thin they could hear their neighbors' every conversation about their own money troubles. "Haha, how many scanners did you sell today?" Linda asked, exhaustion heavy in her voice as she spooned another bite into Christopher's mouth. "Getting close." Chris lied smoothly, loosening his sweat-stained dress shirt that had become his uniform of false hope. "A couple of doctors seemed really interested." Linda looked at him with eyes that had lost their faith long ago, the same eyes that once sparkled when they'd planned their future together in this very kitchen. Christopher ran over and hugged his father's legs. His Superman shirt faded from countless wash cycles in the laundromat downstairs. "Daddy, why do you always carry that big suitcase everywhere?" Chris knelt down and smoothed his son's hair, searching for words that wouldn't reveal their desperate situation. "Because Daddy's working hard to buy us a bigger house, Superman." But reality was far more brutal than any bedtime story. The initial investment in those bone density scanners had drained their savings account, credit cards were maxed out and cancelled, and rent was 3 months overdue. Most painful of all, Linda's trust in him was evaporating faster than their dwindling bank balance. The phone's shrill ring cut through their quiet dinner like a knife. Chris answered, and their landlord's voice came through cold and final. 3 days, Gardner. No money. You're out." "I can't take this anymore." Linda slammed her purse down on the kitchen counter, tears streaming down her face as months of suppressed frustration finally exploded. Chris, I've been patient for 2 years. 2 years of watching you chase this impossible dream while our son eats ramen noodles for dinner again. Christopher clutched his stuffed bear tighter and retreated to the corner of their bedroom, where the raised voices of his parents penetrated even the thin walls that had become too familiar with their arguments. Just give me more time. I can make this work. Chris started, but Linda cut him off with a bitter laugh that held no trace of the woman who had once believed in his vision. Time? What about the electric bill, the water bill, the rent, our son's food? Chris, you're living in a fantasy world while we're drowning in the real one. Her words hit harder than any physical blow, because deep down, Chris knew she was right about everything except one thing. He wasn't living in a fantasy. He was fighting a war he was losing. The next morning, Chris woke up in an apartment that felt like a tomb. A single piece of paper lay on the kitchen table where Linda's coffee cup used to sit. Going to San Jose to find work. Will call when I can. No explanation, no timeline, no promise of return. Just 11 words that shattered what remained of their family unit. Christopher wandered into the kitchen, rubbing sleep from his eyes, and asked the question Chris had been dreading. Where did Mommy go, Daddy? Mommy went on a business trip. Chris managed, pulling his son close while his heart broke into pieces that seemed too small to ever reassemble. She'll call us soon. But weeks turned into months, and that call never came. Month 1. Chris waited by the phone every evening after another day of rejected sales pitches, hoping to hear Linda's voice telling him she was coming home. Month 2. The landlord's visits became more frequent and more threatening, his patience wearing as thin as the carpet in their hallway. Month 3. Police officers arrived with an eviction notice, giving them 24 hours to vacate the premises they'd called home for 3 years. Chris packed their most essential belongings into a backpack and grabbed Christopher's hand, while pulling that cursed suitcase of medical equipment behind them. Daddy, why do we have to leave our house? Christopher asked as they sat on a park bench, watching other families enjoy their Sunday afternoon picnics without a care in the world. We're going on an adventure, buddy, Chris said, forcing enthusiasm into his voice while dying inside. Like the explorers we read about in your books, their first night was spent in a local church shelter, sleeping on cots among dozens of other people who had fallen through society's cracks. The second night found them in the subway station, curled up on hard benches while trains thundered past every few minutes. The third night brought them to that public restroom, the lowest point Chris thought possible until he discovered there were even deeper depths of despair waiting. When police arrested Chris for 25 unpaid parking tickets the next morning, he spent a night in jail staring through metal bars, thinking about his son sleeping at a friend's house and wondering how much lower they could possibly fall. The morning after his release, Chris put on his wrinkled, unwashed suit and walked into the Dean Witter offices for an interview he'd scheduled weeks earlier, back when he still had an address to put on applications. Why do you want to work here? The interviewer asked, clearly noticing Chris's disheveled appearance and questioning his judgment. Because I want to change my life and my son's life. Chris answered with a conviction that surprised even himself. This is our last chance. The interviewer studied him for a long moment before delivering the crushing details. This is an unpaid internship program. 6 months, 20 people start, only 1 gets hired. Are you absolutely sure about this? 1 month before that life-changing interview, Chris had been sitting at a bus stop with Christopher when a brilliant red Ferrari pulled up to the curb nearby. The man who stepped out wore a suit that probably cost more than Chris made in 6 months, and he had his phone pressed to his ear with the confidence of someone who controlled his own destiny. 200 shares of IBM, sell immediately! The man commanded into his phone, his voice carrying the authority of someone who made decisions that moved mountains of money. Christopher pointed excitedly at the gleaming sports car, his eyes wide with childhood wonder. Daddy, Look at that beautiful car. Chris watched the well-dressed man stride into a towering building with a sign that read Dean Witter Reynolds in elegant gold lettering. Curiosity got the better of him, and he approached the security guard stationed at the building's entrance. "Excuse me, what does that man do for work?" Chris asked, nodding toward the disappearing figure. "He's a stockbroker. Plays the market." The guard replied with a knowing smile. "Makes money from money, if you know what I mean." Chris felt his pulse quicken as he asked the question that would change everything. "What kind of education do you need for that?" The security guard chuckled and shook his head. "Education. You need luck and brains, son. Sometimes more luck than brains." From that moment forward, Chris devoted every spare minute to learning about the stock market and financial industry. He read discarded newspapers from trash cans, searching for business sections and stock reports. He snuck into the public library during their lunch hours, studying financial terminology and memorizing the names of major companies and their stock symbols. He watched the business news on televisions in electronics store windows, absorbing information about market trends and economic indicators like a man dying of thirst drinking water. When Chris finally submitted his application to Dean Witter, he impressed them with his persistence rather than his credentials. He waited in the lobby for 3 hours to meet Jay Twistle, the head of their internship program, refusing to leave until someone would listen to his pitch. Jay was a middle-aged man with graying hair and the tired eyes of someone who had seen too many hopeful candidates crash and burn in the unforgiving world of high finance. "Do you have any experience in finance or economics?" Jay asked, without looking up from Chris's nearly empty resume, which consisted mainly of his medical equipment sales background and little else. "No, sir, I don't," Chris replied honestly, his voice steady despite the stakes. "But I have something more important than experience." Jay stopped writing and looked directly into Chris's eyes for the first time during the interview. "And what might that be?" "I don't have any other choice. This is my last opportunity, and I'll work harder than anyone else in that program because failure isn't an option for me." There was something in Chris's voice, not desperation exactly, but an unshakable determination that made Jay pause and reconsider. He reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a scrambled Rubik's Cube, setting it on the desk between them. "Do you know how to solve one of these?" Jay asked, his tone suggesting this was more than casual curiosity. "No, sir, I've never tried," Chris answered, wondering where this unexpected test was heading. "If you can solve this puzzle during our taxi ride to my next appointment, I'll seriously consider your application." Jay stood up and headed for the door, leaving Chris no choice but to follow him to the waiting cab outside. During the 20-minute taxi ride through San Francisco's afternoon traffic, Chris studied the colorful cube with laser focus, his mind working to identify patterns and logical sequences. The taxi driver occasionally glanced in his rearview mirror, watching this intense man manipulating the puzzle with the concentration of a surgeon performing a life-saving operation. Traffic lights, car horns, and street noise faded into background as Chris entered a zone of complete mental absorption. "Done," Chris announced, holding up the completed cube with all sides showing solid colors. Jay took the puzzle and examined it carefully, clearly impressed despite his attempt to maintain professional composure. "How did you figure that out so quickly?" he asked, genuinely curious about this unexpected display of problem-solving ability. "I studied mathematics in college. It's all about pattern recognition," Chris explained. "Everything has a logical sequence. You just have to find it." Jay studied Chris for a long moment, then smiled for the first time since they'd met. "Welcome to Dean Witter, Chris, but I need to warn you about what you're getting into. This is brutal competition. Your 19 competitors all come from Stanford, Harvard, Wharton. They have connections, family money, and Ivy League educations. And you—" Jay paused, choosing his words carefully. "You'll be starting from a very different place. Every morning at 5:30 a.m., Chris woke up in whatever shelter or safe space he'd managed to secure for the night, carefully extracting himself from Christopher's sleeping embrace. His son was still breathing softly, his small body curled around a worn teddy bear that had become their one constant companion through all the uncertainty. Chris would quietly borrow his son's cleanest sweater because it was the only clothing item that didn't smell like the streets or the shelters where they spent their nights. By 6:15 a.m., Chris was at his desk at Dean Witter, arriving earlier than all the other interns who commuted from comfortable apartments and family homes in better neighborhoods. Martin Frome, the Yale graduate who seemed to take personal pleasure in reminding everyone of his prestigious background, looked at Chris's increasingly threadbare suit with undisguised disdain. "Hey, buddy, where did you sleep last night? In your car?" Martin's voice carried just enough volume for the other interns to hear, establishing the social hierarchy he believed should exist among them. Chris didn't respond to the provocation, instead opening his computer and diving into the client database with singular focus. He had discovered his first survival strategy: never waste a single second on anything that didn't advance his goal. While other interns socialized over coffee and discussed their weekend plans, Chris made phone calls to potential clients, his fingers flying across the keyboard as he researched companies and market trends with the intensity of a man whose life depended on each decision. His second survival strategy emerged from pure necessity. If he didn't drink water during the day, he wouldn't need bathroom breaks, saving approximately 8 minutes that could be spent on client calls. Every minute mattered when you were competing against people who had every advantage except hunger and desperation. Chris learned to make those saved minutes count, squeezing in 2 or 3 additional client contacts while his competitors took coffee breaks or chatted about their college experiences. "Gardner, what happened to that client I referred to you?" Martin demanded one afternoon, his face flushed with anger and embarrassment. "Mr. Peterson, I closed a $50,000 transaction with him this morning." Chris replied calmly, not looking up from his computer screen where he was already researching his next potential client. Martin's face turned an even deeper shade of red as he struggled to process what had just happened to what he considered his guaranteed sale. "That client was mine! I spent weeks developing that relationship." Martin protested, his voice rising enough to attract attention from other interns and several full-time employees. "He said he wanted to work with someone who understood medical technology markets," Chris explained, matter-of-factly. "I told him about my experience selling bone density scanners to medical practices." What Chris didn't mention was how he had turned his greatest professional failure into his most valuable selling point, transforming years of rejection in the medical equipment field into credibility with a client who needed exactly that specialized knowledge. Every evening, Chris would pick up Christopher from whatever temporary childcare arrangement he'd managed to secure for the day, usually involving the kindness of shelter staff or other parents who understood desperate circumstances. "Daddy, why do you come home so late every night?" Christopher would ask, his small hand gripping Chris's larger one as they walked back to whatever shelter had space available. "Because Daddy is learning how to become really good at helping people with their money," Chris would explain, hiding his exhaustion behind a smile that felt more genuine each day as his confidence grew. "Like Superman?" Christopher would ask, his eyes lighting up with the same enthusiasm he showed when they read comic books together before bedtime in whatever temporary space they called home that night. "Even better than Superman," Chris would assure him, realizing that he was starting to believe it himself. Week by week, his sales numbers climbed higher and his confidence grew stronger, fueled by the knowledge that every successful client call brought them closer to stability and safety. By the 8th week of the program, Chris had climbed to 3rd place in overall sales performance, a ranking that seemed impossible given his circumstances, but felt inevitable given his relentless work ethic. Jay Twistle called him into his private office, closing the door behind them in a way that suggested a serious conversation was about to take place. "Gardner, you're doing excellent work, but I've been hearing some concerning rumors about your personal situation," Jay said, his tone walking the careful line between professional concern and personal curiosity. "Nothing that affects my work performance, sir," Chris replied, maintaining the professional distance he'd carefully constructed around his private struggles. "Some colleagues have mentioned that you might be staying in homeless shelters?" Jay's question hung in the air like a challenge, testing whether Chris would maintain his composure or crack under the pressure of exposure. Chris straightened his shoulders and looked Jay directly in the eye. "Where I sleep doesn't change the fact that I'm here every morning, ready to work. My personal circumstances don't affect my professional capabilities." That night proved to be one of their most challenging yet, when Christopher developed a high fever and Chris had no money for a doctor visit or medication. All he could do was hold his son through the long night, wiping away sweat and whispering reassurances while praying that morning would bring improvement. "Daddy, I hurt everywhere," Christopher whispered, his small body shaking with chills despite the fever that made his skin burn to the touch. "I'm right here with you, Superman. Daddy's not going anywhere," Chris promised, understanding with crystal clarity that he wasn't just fighting for his own future anymore, but for his son's chance at a better life. The next morning, Chris arrived at the office with red-rimmed eyes and clothes that clearly hadn't been changed in over 24 hours. Martin Frome noticed immediately and couldn't resist delivering what he thought would be a crushing blow. "This is it, Gardner. You're about to be eliminated from the program," he said with a satisfied smirk that revealed how much he'd been looking forward to this moment. What Martin didn't realize was that his taunt only strengthened Chris's resolve to prove that privilege and connections couldn't overcome pure determination and refusal to quit. 6 months passed like a fever dream of 18-hour workdays, sleepless nights spent in shelters and public spaces, and the constant pressure of competing against candidates who had every conceivable advantage except the one that mattered most in this particular crucible: the absolute refusal to accept failure when success meant the difference between his son having a future or remaining trapped in the cycle of poverty and instability. From the original 20 interns who had started the program with such high hopes and competitive energy, only 2 remained standing after the grueling elimination process. Chris Gardner and Martin Frome, representing 2 completely different paths to the same ultimate goal. The final weeks had been particularly brutal, with assignments designed to test not just knowledge and skill, but character and perseverance under extreme pressure. Chris had maintained his perfect attendance record despite nights when Christopher was sick and they had nowhere safe to rest, despite mornings when he had to choose between buying food and paying for transportation to work, despite the constant stress of never knowing where they would sleep from one night to the next. "Gardner, come into my office, please," Jay Twistle called out across the trading floor, his expression carefully neutral in a way that made it impossible to predict whether this summons carried good news or the devastating blow that would end their hopes forever. Chris walked across the office with measured steps, aware that every eye was watching him, including Christopher's small face pressed against the lobby window, where he waited with Mrs. Rodriguez, the shelter supervisor who had become like family to them over these difficult months. "Have a seat," Jay said, closing the door behind them and moving to his desk with the deliberate pace of someone who understood the weight of the words he was about to speak and their power to either destroy or transform a life completely. The office felt smaller than usual, as if the walls were closing in, and the silence stretched between them like a bridge spanning an enormous chasm. 30 seconds of quiet stretched between them like 30 years, each tick of the wall clock marking another heartbeat of uncertainty in Chris's chest as he prepared himself mentally for either triumph or devastation. Chris, after 6 months of observation, evaluation, and careful consideration of all factors involved, we've made our final decision about who will receive the one available position in our company. Jay began, his voice carrying the gravity of a judge delivering a verdict that would determine not just Chris's future, but Christopher's as well. Chris bit his lower lip and braced himself for the possibility that all their sacrifice, all those nights in shelters and public restrooms, all those 18-hour days and missed meals had led to nothing but another dead end in their increasingly desperate journey toward stability. "We want you to stay with Dean Witter Reynolds." The words took several long seconds to register in Chris's mind, like a foreign language that needed translation before he could understand their meaning and accept their reality. "Excuse me, sir?" he asked, needing confirmation that he had heard correctly and wasn't experiencing some kind of exhaustion-induced hallucination brought on by months of impossible stress and sleep deprivation. "You're hired, Chris, officially and permanently, with a starting salary of $80,000 per year, full benefits, and all the support you need to build a successful career in financial services." Jay's words were followed by a silence that seemed to expand and fill the entire office, the entire building, the entire world, as Chris sat perfectly still, absorbing the reality that their nightmare was finally ending and their new life was about to begin in ways he had barely dared to imagine. For what felt like an eternity, Chris remained motionless in his chair, staring directly at Jay as if moving might break the spell and return them to the harsh reality of shelters, uncertainty, and constant fear about their future. Then slowly, tears began to flow down his cheeks, not the tears of desperation and fear that had become so familiar over the past months, but tears of relief and joy that felt foreign after so many weeks of struggle and disappointment. "Thank you, sir. Thank you so much for this opportunity and for believing in me when I couldn't always believe in myself," Chris managed to say through his tears, his voice thick with emotions he'd been suppressing for 6 months while focusing solely on survival and performance. "You earned every bit of this, Gardner. I've never seen anyone make as many client calls as you did, and your ability to never give up, no matter how many rejections you faced, that's exactly the kind of character we need in our organization," Jay replied, his own voice softer now that the professional formality could give way to genuine human connection and mutual respect. Chris stepped out of the office and onto the busy San Francisco sidewalk, where the afternoon sunlight seemed brighter and warmer than it had in months, as if the sun itself was celebrating their victory over circumstances that had seemed insurmountable just hours earlier. He stood motionless on the crowded sidewalk, letting tears flow freely for the first time since this ordeal began, while pedestrians hurried past him, completely unaware that they were witnessing a moment of complete transformation from despair to hope, from failure to success, from homeless to hero. Christopher ran toward his father with the boundless energy and pure joy that only 5-year-olds possess, somehow maintaining his optimism and trust through circumstances that would have crushed most adults and left them broken and bitter. "Daddy, why are you crying? Are you sad about something?" he asked, his small hands reaching up to touch his father's wet cheeks with the tender concern that had sustained Chris through their darkest moments and given him strength when he had none left. "I'm crying because I'm happier than I've ever been in my whole life, Superman," Chris said, kneeling down to embrace his son with an intensity that tried to communicate all the love, relief, and promises for their future that words couldn't adequately express. "What does that mean, Daddy? What happened that made you so happy?" Christopher asked, his innocence allowing him to accept joy as easily as he had accepted hardship, without question, qualification, or the cynicism that life sometimes teaches adults. Chris held his son tighter and spoke the words he'd been dreaming of saying for 6 months, words that felt solid and achievable for the first time, rather than just desperate hopes built on shifting sand. It means we're going to have our own home now, a real home with your own bedroom and everything you need to be safe and happy. We're never going to have to sleep in shelters or wonder where our next meal is coming from ever again. 1 year later, Chris Gardner had transformed from a desperate intern into one of Dean Witter's most successful brokers, earning commissions that allowed him to rent a comfortable 2-bedroom apartment with a stunning view of San Francisco Bay and the Golden Gate Bridge. Christopher attended a prestigious private school where he wore a crisp navy blue uniform and carried a backpack filled with books, art supplies, and all the tools of learning instead of their few remaining possessions. His Superman t-shirt was now reserved for bedtime and weekend play, no longer serving as their primary piece of warm clothing during cold nights on the streets. "Daddy, do you remember when we used to sleep at the train station and you would tell me stories about superheroes to help me fall asleep?" Christopher asked one evening, as Chris tucked him into his own bed in his own room, surrounded by toys, books, and all the security items that represented the childhood Chris had fought so hard to provide. "I remember every single night, buddy. Why do you ask about those times?" Chris replied, smoothing his son's hair that was now neatly cut and styled instead of hanging long and unkempt from their homeless months. "I think that was the best adventure we ever had together," Christopher said, with the profound wisdom that children sometimes possess, understanding truths that adults spend years trying to learn. "Even though we didn't have a house, or very much food, I felt safe because you were always there with me, and you never got angry or scared, even when things were really hard." His words reminded Chris that while he had been focused on providing material security and meeting basic needs, he had actually been providing something far more valuable: the absolute certainty that his love was unconditional and permanent, regardless of their circumstances. The old brown suitcase that had once contained his failed medical equipment business now sat prominently in his executive office, not as a reminder of past failures, but as a testament to the truth that every ending contains the seeds of a new beginning. Every time he looked at that battered case, Chris remembered that the man who had dragged it through the streets of San Francisco in desperation had become the man who now helped others achieve their financial dreams, proving that transformation is possible for anyone willing to work harder than they ever thought possible and never, ever give up on the future they know they deserve.